New York City's population, it's growing, economy booming, real estate exploding, but it wasn't always that way. In fact, just a few decades ago, the city, it was on the brink of bankruptcy. A new book called Fierce City, New York's Fiscal Crisis and the Rise of Austerity Politics, it tells that story. I sat down with its author, Kim Phillips-Fein. You know, I think, as you say in there, for a lot of people looking back at that time in the mid-70s, when New York literally teetered on the verge of bankruptcy, a lot of people only know that snapshot from that daily news cover for the city dropped dead. But what I was surprised to learn in the book is it came as a shock to New Yorkers just how bad the financial situation was in New York City. People either didn't want to believe or couldn't believe that the financial capital of the world was really that close to hanging up a bankruptcy sign.
Yeah, I think it was very difficult for both the leaders of the city, including the administration of the mayor, Abe Beame. It was very difficult for both the leaders of the city and the general public to really have a sense of the difficult situation the city was in.
So what led to that situation? How did things get so bad?
So one of the things that was really unique about New York over the whole post-war period was its expansive vision of the role of government in city life. For a while, there was a large amount of money flowing in from the federal government. New York's economy was strong in the late 1960s, but then it turns, and the recession of the early 1970s hits New York very hard, and it comes at the same time that Nixon is in office in Washington, and the the increase in social spending of the 1960s starts to taper off. And these, New York is kind of going every year to Albany, asking for new taxing powers, asking for additional aid from the state government. And so this is kind of what the question of who will pay for this expansive social state, especially in a time of recession and retrenchment at the federal level. That's really what brings the city to the fiscal crisis. That and what the city winds up doing is expanding its short-term debt in ways that wind up bringing it in this very, it becomes very dependent on the goodwill of the financial community and the banks, and that's what brings it to the fiscal crisis.
And to that point, as you say in the book, that there were several misreads, most notably by the then mayor, Abe Beame, in that he never thought that the financial institutions of New York would ever, in effect, turn off the spigot to the city that they resided in. And secondly, he thought Gerald Ford was this moderate Republican, and he had a misread on the political sense of really where we see the Republican Party today. The beginnings of it were there, which was, you mentioned some of the names that are familiar to people, Alan Greenspan, Donald Rumsfeld at the time, where they were like, make an example of New York here and make an example of cities like this, that they can't keep putting their hand out. We got to teach them a lesson. All those things conspired at the same time, and it really caught a mayor and a city flat-footed.
The banks were perfectly willing to finance New York's debt for quite a long time, and the rating agencies gave it strong ratings. I mean, in a way, that the whole financial community was really quite complicit in the expansion of the city's debt. So he would have had, I think, good reason for a long while to expect that the banks would keep floating the city along. And then, yes, I think part of what happens is, and this is actually really what brings the city to the point of bankruptcy, is the hostility of the federal government, especially some of those people you mentioned in the Ford administration, Greenspan, who is the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, kind of fresh from the circles of Ayn Rand, Donald Rumsfeld, who was his chief of staff, was very hostile to New York, and the Treasury Secretary, William Simon, who, despite coming out of municipal bonds himself, thought that New York needed to be taught a lesson. Part of what made this such a crisis was that for the rising conservative movement, New York, kind of disciplining New York was of a piece with teaching Americans more generally that they couldn't expect things from their government and redefining what it meant to be a citizen in a much narrower way.
Did they have other choices, though, Kim? And this is where we introduce austerity politics, and literally they had to cut, in effect, 20% across the board here. Given the shortness of time, and as you detail in the book, there was moments where they really thought, yep, we're going to have to call this, we're going to have to go bankruptcy. Basically, a modern-day Detroit would have been New York City. Yeah. Did they really have the luxury of time to consider other options, or did they have to go down this road given all the competing factors and the limitations of really alternatives in time?
Yeah, I think it's a fair point. What could the city have done? But I think part of the issue is, how did things get to that point in the first place, where it came to seem as though there was no alternative but to reduce the police force by 20% at the very moment that crime is rising, to reduce the staff of the fire department by a little less, roughly 20%. It was a little bit less at the very moment, again, that there is a fire epidemic in the Bronx and in parts of Brooklyn. How did it come to seem as though this was the only possible option? And I think it does partly, I think there's technically one can imagine other solutions. I think a different attitude from the federal government would have made a big difference. I think questions about the city's tax base relative to that of the suburbs, the whole question of at what level of government is the appropriate one to finance these kinds of social programs. I think calling those things, kind of raising those questions is what would have opened up more options and possibilities for the city.
Well, again, the book is For Your City. Kim Phillips-Fein, really interesting book here, and I think, as you said, especially timely given what we're seeing not just in New York, but in the nation as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And coming up next, our Hudson Valley headlines, so please stay with us.